Hello and welcome to this edition of Here's What's Cooking at Key Chorale. For this very special edition, we'll explore some interesting musical mysteries that are part of our next presentation, Mystics and Kings, with the Sarasota Ballet Studio Company, Sunday, November 27th at the Sarasota Opera House. So, let's get set for Here's What's Cooking. Unsolved Mysteries. Like many of the great detectives, we'll get to the bottom of things, and we'll get you ready for a concert unique in every way, an experience that is both a feast for your ears and your eyes. We'll perform Sing Wearing the Sky, a new work by Jake Runestad, setting the words of 14th century Indian mystic Lala, James Whitbourne's breathtaking work of sheer beauty and mystery titled Luminosity, and the Ballad of the Brown King by Black female composer Margaret Bonds. This piece incorporates many styles from classical to jazz, to blues and spirituals, and even a little calypso. Combine all of that with the Sarasota Ballet Studio Company, and you have a must-see event. So let's take a look at some of these musical mysteries. So, who is this Margaret Bonds? And why don't most of us know anything about her? Margaret Bonds was one of the most successful Black female composers of the 20th century. She studied piano and composition with Florence Price, another Black composer and pianist. Bonds maintained an active career as a performer, composer, and teacher, but hers is a name that few of us know, and even fewer know her music. I must confess that I had never heard of her until we were preparing for Morning Coffee and Maestros, enlightening video conversations that were recorded during the pandemic, which you can still check out on Key Chorale's YouTube channel. One episode was titled Black Composers Who Changed the Course of Music. In my study for this episode, I discovered the Ballad of the Brown King, and I fell in love with it. Once I heard this work, I knew I had to create a program to showcase this rarely heard gem. The composer was Margaret Bonds, and the only piece of hers I knew was an arrangement of He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, which she wrote for the operatic superstar Leontyne Price. Margaret Allison Bonds was born on March 3, 1913, in the city of Chicago. Her mother, Estella Bonds, was a musician, piano teacher, and choir director and organist at her local church. She taught piano to Margaret from a very early age. During high school, Margaret Bonds studied composition and piano with Florence Price, the first African-American woman to be recognized as a symphonic composer and to have her works performed by major orchestras. On June 13, 1933, Margaret Bonds performed John Alden Carpenter's Concertino with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Her debut marked the first time that an African-American artist was a soloist with the world-renowned ensemble. 1 year later, she performed Florence Price's Piano Concerto in D minor with the Women's Symphony Orchestra of Chicago on a concert that was broadcasted on CBS. Both of these extraordinary women found a way to marry European classical tradition with melodies from African-American spirituals and folk tunes in remarkable ways. The career of Margaret Bonds extended from the 1930s into the 1960s, a period in which the nation's cultural and political landscapes were dramatically shaped by the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Renaissance, and the modern civil rights movement. In August of 1939, and with only $37 in her pocket, Bonds moved to Harlem, where she met longtime friend and Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes. The two were close. She said they were like brother and sister, like blood relatives. Bonds expressed to Hughes, "It is a great mission to tell Negroes how great they are." She said, "I realized very young that I was the link between Negro composers of the past. You see, my mother was friends with all of them. I hear the young Negro composers of today, and many of them are trying to reconcile atonality with the Negro idiom, and they just don't go together. I think, if anything, if I deserve credit at all, it's that I have stuck to my own ethnic material and worked to develop it." The Ballad of the Brown King was one of their most significant collaborations. The ballad was first performed in 1954 in a shorter version with only piano accompaniment. Later, inspired by the civil rights movement, Bonds requested poetry from Hughes for 2 new movements, expanded the ballet's instrumentation to a full orchestra, and dedicated the work to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was televised December 11 in 1960 for a CBS special titled Christmas USA. The Ballad of the Brown King is characterized by call and response textures, jazz harmonies, blues, gospel styles, calypso rhythms, and syncopated gestures. In this way, Bonds affirms Black identity and its place within classical music. The Ballad of the Brown King focuses on Balthasar, the dark-skinned king, as he traveled to Bethlehem to bring gifts to the infant Savior, Jesus of Nazareth. So, who are these 3 kings? No, not those 3 kings. These 3 kings. The only reference to these men in the Bible is in chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew, and they're not called wise men or kings. There's also no mention of how many men were there. It only describes some men from the east and visitors from the east. Kristen Swenson, an associate professor of religious studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, says they are called magi in the Greek, which was a term that referred to the kind of subclass of Persian priests. But they have come to be known as wise men. Their orientation was much more in what we might today identify with science. Looking to a star is very much in keeping with the religious tradition of looking to the heavens, the stars, and the planets for information about the God's wishes and doings. And some stars or planets are identified with God. The Magi's post-biblical careers have really taken off. As early as the 2nd century, they were promoted to kings, likely because frankincense is associated with royalty in one of the Psalms. Their number, which had varied from 2 to 12, eventually settled in on 3, most likely because of their 3 gifts. Thanks in part from a Greek manuscript from AD 500, the trio earned their legendary names, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar. An 8th century text attributed to Saint Bede, a historian monk from Northumbria, seems to be the first to describe Balthasar as black. Despite Bede's assertion, there are very few images of Black Balthasar before 1400, but by the 15th and 16th centuries, artists had portrayed this black king as we now have come to know him, and it was with this image and idea of the dark-skinned king that inspired Langston Hughes and Margaret Bonds. In this 9-movement work, Bonds and Hughes explore this brown king and his importance. The 6th movement, titled Could He Have Been an Ethiop, contains the most expansive and expressive moments. This movement takes the listener on a royal tour of the great kingdoms of Africa. The choir and the soloists ask at various times about the kingships of Ethiopia, Egypt, and Arabia, trying to determine his origins. Regardless of the ethnicity of Balthasar, the choir proclaims, "I don't know just who he was, but he was a wise, wise man." The text concludes, "Of all the kings who came to call, one was dark like me, and I'm so glad that he was there, our little Christ to see." So this leads us to another musical mystery. Why has this piece been neglected all of these years? Well, over time, the concert hall has not been known for celebrating women's voices, and hearing the works by Black female composers until recently was almost unheard of. The work was published in 1961 and had a number of performances, but eventually the music became out of print, and it was so for many decades. Couple that with the fact that there has never been a recording of this cantata, and you can see why so few of us have had the opportunity to hear this glorious music. Sadly, most of her music still remains unpublished and unrecorded. In 1960, Bonds wrote to Langston Hughes that she yearned to capture a recording of one good performance of the cantata. Well, that day had to wait until 2019, when baritone and conductor Malcolm J. Merriweather released the world premiere recording of the Ballad of the Brown King. In fact, when I first heard it, I just assumed it was an old recording from when it premiered. In 2018, Malcolm Merriweather created a piano vocal score correcting many of the errors and mistakes from the original published version from 1961. He was then able to procure the full orchestration and rescore it for a modest-sized orchestra of strings, organ, and harp. It's a beautiful orchestration, and now this gorgeous piece may finally get its due. We are excited to be the first group to perform this instrumentation since it was recorded for the world premiere. So indeed, this will be a wonderful opportunity to hear this too long forgotten work of a master composer. And now for something completely different. The mystic part of Mystics and Kings is represented by two works, both with Indian influences. These are works set to mystical texts, works that incorporate ancient instruments, and pieces that truly evoke and set a transcendent mood. We open the program with an enchanting pas de deux choreographed by Gemma Bonds. They will dance to a unique work by Jake Runestad, who sets the words of 14th century Sufi mystic Lala. Lala lived in the Kashmir region of India and believed strongly in the development of self while reaching enlightenment. This text talks about being free or naked, which exemplifies the beauty of empowerment and self-worth. It will be performed by the sopranos and the altos, along with Daniel Jordan on violin, percussion, and Nancy Yost Olson on piano. This is such a captivating piece. The other extended work is by English composer James Whitbourne, titled Luminosity. It premiered in 2008, and ever since it has been in my must-do pile of music, and I am so thrilled for the opportunity to finally bring this piece to life. If you followed Chorale over the years, you might recognize James Whitbourne, as we have performed two of his works in the past, Missa Chorale, a Latin mass based on tunes associated with Christmas, and Annalise, which sets the words from the Diary of Anne Frank to music in a very powerful score. For Luminosity, James compiled a number of texts centering on the beauty of creation, from quite a range of mystic writers and religions, people like Julian of Norwich, Isaac of Nineveh, Ryonan, a Zen Buddhist nun, and others. His concept of the work was to include a dance or visual element. And I know when I first heard it, I knew the visual element was such an important one, so it was a natural to present this in our annual collaboration with the Sarasota Ballet Studio Company. Choreographer Lindsay Fisher has truly embraced this score and provided an imaginative and evocative ballet to complement this exquisite music. So what is the mystery associated with this piece? Well, I think the mystery is that James uses a particularly unusual instrument rarely heard on the concert stage, the tanpura. In addition to the tanpura, Whitbourne also incorporates an organ, a tam-tam or a gong, and a viola playing in the Carnatic style. So maybe before we talk about the tanpura, let's give the briefest overview of Indian classical music ever. During the medieval period, Indian classical music was generally based on two traditions, the Carnatic music prevalent in South India and the Hindustani classical music in North India. Both traditions are woven deeply into religion. So, what are some of the differences? Hindustani originated much earlier than Carnatic music. Carnatic music's origins go back to the 15th and 16th centuries and saw a bit of revival during the 19th and 20th centuries. Generally speaking, Hindustani music is more about the melody, and Carnatic is more rhythmically driven. Hindustani tradition divides its scale into 12 musical notes, and Carnatic tradition divides its octave into 22 notes. So Carnatic music uses microtones, which is just one of the ways that it seems so remote from European classical music traditions. Tanpura. So let's decode this unique instrument. The tanpura, not to be confused with shrimp tempura, which is delicious, but not very musical. There are three main stringed instruments used in Hindustani and Carnatic music in India: the veena, the sitar, and the tanpura. These instruments all look very similar, and it's easy to confuse one for the other. Each of them has a body made of wood and a gourd which allows it to resonate, and they each have multiple strings. The veena is used in Carnatic music. Its name veena comes from the Sanskrit, and is a generic term used for plucked stringed instruments. The veena predates both the sitar and the tanpura. Thanks to Ravi Shankar and George Harrison of the Beatles, most of us have an idea of what the sitar is. The sitar is a long-necked lute with a gourd resonator, and it's mostly associated with Hindustani classical music. Now we come to the tanpura. The tanpura is a drone instrument found across the Indian subcontinent. Its construction is simple, with a gourd at its base and a long neck. The tanpura looks a little bit like a sitar, but does not have any frets. This is not a melodic instrument like the veena or the sitar. The tanpura supports and sustains the melody, and instead of melodies, the tanpura plays drones. So what is a drone? A drone can be one pitch, usually a low note that is sustained for long periods of time, while a melody is played above the drone. If you remember our last concert, we featured the bagpipes. Well, the bagpipes have a drone and a chanter which plays the melody above that drone. So when you hear the bagpipes, you'll notice that the melody is always played above a sustained drone. What's interesting about the tanpura is it has several notes that can be played in combination, or one after another, to create a sort of layered sound of drones. So when you hear a drone, it's generally a low note, like this, and it'll be played with a melody above. But what's interesting about the tanpura is it has several different notes. It can be played in a random sequence. And so you have this drone, but it's a drone of several notes. And it's a D and an A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that A gives a harmonic function, because when you listen to that drone, all of a sudden you can hear a minor chord. You can hear a major chord. All happening with this drone. Now I know what you're thinking. Why do I keep droning on? The tanpura is most often played seated with the instrument upright. The fingers on the right hand are placed parallel to the strings in a position where each finger can easily touch the string. Most tanpuras have 4 to 5 strings and are played by pushing in and gently plucking the string. The sound it creates has a bit of a metallic sound, but by playing these strings one at a time, it creates a very unique and interesting tone. The best playing produces a continuous drone sound with rich overtones. Here's an example. We are fortunate to have Kanada Narahari, a very gifted musician, to play not only the tanpura, but also the sitar during this program. Both he and violist Rachel Halverson will be placed on the house right side of the stage to incorporate the musicians into the dance and so that we can watch them play. So what I think is most masterful about Whitbourne's luminosity is the way he utilizes this drone and makes it such an integral part of the score. So if you think about it, the tanpura can only be tuned to certain notes. So the composer, in this case, is limited to just the notes D and A. So you can imagine a 20 to 25 minute work incorporating this drone throughout could get very monotonous. But Whitbourne finds a great way to work with and against this drone. So what happens is you hear that wonderful drone happening, and above it, he has the singer sing. And what you hear is the consonants in that phrase, not dissonance, which matches the drone. The second phrase is a little different. Do you hear the dissonance? So that's where he works with this drone, sometimes to give you dissonance, sometimes to give you consonants. And as you go on with the piece, he has so many nice moments. And sometimes the organ is also playing the drone. And he asks the organist to lift fingers up and down, so you just don't hear a blocked chord, but you hear. And when you hear the choir with moments like this, you can hear the dissonance and the consonants. And then you have moments moments that are really, truly special. It comes back to, and this dissonance, and then you hear this moment. And you hear that dissonance. That's a C sharp against D, which is like Tito. So you hear, and in this music, especially in their carnatic style, you hear this la, a resolution, but it leans into that dissonance. La, and it's a slow resolution. Sometimes you'll hear it with a lowered seventh. So if you heard the lower seventh, it would be so all the way down from C sharp, we start at C. So in the Jake Runestad piece, you'll hear a lot of this. But in James's piece, you'll hear a lot more of this raised seventh. A lot of times in Whitbourne's piece, he gives a lot of that gesture to the viola. And the viola plays in this carnatic style, which is really bringing out this wonderful dissonance and they also hear a lot of little sighing sort of sounds that are like singing, but also like sighing. So it gives you this sort of really sense of the viola actually singing throughout this piece, or sometimes even wailing. And it's very interesting. So what I love most about this program is we get to hear instruments we don't often hear in the concert hall. And we get to be exposed to elements of Indian classical music that many of us have very little experience. Music to me is about exploration and discovery. It's about learning new things, learning new styles, learning new pieces. This collection of music I've put together for Mystics and Kings embraces that spirit. It will truly be a feast for the senses, combining this incredible music with the beauty of the human body. We are grateful for this annual collaboration with the Sarasota Ballet Studio Company, and we are so looking forward to working with these amazing dancers, incredible musicians, talented choreographers, and of course the most important, the 110 voices of Key Chorale. We hope to see you at the Sarasota Opera House on November 27th at 4 p.m. See you there.